Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Hudson Institute. My name's Nate Sibley. I'm a research fellow here heading up our kleptocracy initiative on countering authoritarian corruption. So we do a lot of work on Russia, as you can imagine. For those of you joining us for the first time, though, we're a non-partisan think tank based in Washington, D.C., promoting American leadership for a secure, free, and prosperous future. Today, I'm honored to welcome back to Hudson someone who not only shares those values, but has fought tirelessly to advance them at the highest levels of US policymaking. Senator Jim Risch has served as US Senator for Idaho since 2009 and is currently the ranking member of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, having previously served as its chairman. Through the committee, Senator Risch has promoted a robust approach to safeguarding American interests and those of our allies. And it's about new ways, cost-effective ways, of supporting our ally Ukraine that he's going to speak to us today. Specifically, Senator Risch is a leading co-sponsor of the bipartisan Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunity, or REPO, for Ukrainians Act. This legislation would, among other measures, authorize the confiscation of frozen Russian assets to be repurposed for Ukraine assistance. I have to note that Hudson doesn't take institutional positions and can't endorse specific legislation, but the REPO Act carries potentially profound policy implications. So immediately after the Senator's remarks, I'll be moderating an expert discussion panel to explore these issues in more detail. Senator, you were last here, I think, in April to speak with my colleague Rebecca Heinrichs, who's kindly also joining us again today, about why supporting Ukrainian victory remains firmly in America's interests. Thank you for your continued leadership on this in the Senate, and we look forward to learning more about your plans for the REPO Act today.
Well, thank you very much, and it's good to be back here again. Let me say that the remarks I made in April about why victory in Ukraine is critically important to American national security interests, actually for the planet's national security interest. Nothing has changed since then, other than I think that there's even a clearer understanding that it is important that there be a victory there, and that Putin is defeated, and that he is restrained from further ambitions on the planet. Today marks the 631st day since the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine. Over the last year and a half, Putin has single-handedly brought the war back to Europe. We've seen Russian troops commit unspeakable crimes against the Ukrainian people, including the indiscriminate targeting of civilian areas, indeed at times deliberate targeting of civilian areas and infrastructure, mass graves, sexual violence, kidnappings, and countless other horrors. Putin is making every effort to eliminate the Ukrainian people by committing atrocities that amount to serious war crimes, including genocide. Russia has to pay for the devastation it has caused, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Indeed, it's rare I get a chance to stand up here and tell you that the effort that we're making here is an effort that is bipartisan, it is bicameral, and we occasionally see issues like that. But more importantly, there is enthusiasm for this particular issue on all parts. So in that regard, it's fun to be doing one of these instead of constantly fighting over something. In Kyiv and Irpin last year, I saw firsthand some of the destruction that Russia has rained down on Ukrainian infrastructure, homes, schools, business, and manufacturing. The scale of the damage, as you all know, is immense. This devastation has decimated Ukraine's economy, with experts placing current estimates to rebuild at over $400 billion. That number will only increase more and the longer that this war drags on. The harsh reality presents the United States and its allies with a problem. How do we hold Russia, a major economy with significant resources and veto powers at major international institutions, accountable for its invasion of Ukraine, the destruction it has created, and the lives that it has cost? And how can we best keep Ukraine, rebuild its country, save its economy, and become integrated more into the West? This is really a simple process, a simple matter. Russia broke it, they ought to pay for it. That's really, really simple. We understand it. The world understands that. The international community has overwhelmingly condemned Russia for its war of aggression. Indeed, the International Court of Justice ruled that Russia's invasion has violated international law, and the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution establishing Russia's duty to provide reparations to Ukraine. The G7 has also issued multiple statements asserting that Russia must pay for Ukraine's reconstruction. That's what we're talking about today, and that's what this effort that we're pursuing here is very clearly targeted at. The problem, of course, is that Russia has ignored all of this. Why? Because it can. Putin has refused to discuss compensation for damages, of course. He's let alone agree to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine, and worse, inflicts continual destruction. Russia also continues to use its veto powers at the UN and other international institutions which house traditional mechanisms for compensation, effectively rendering these mechanisms useless. So we knew we need to do more, thus the REPO Act. Meanwhile, public reporting indicates that there is more than $300 billion in Russian sovereign assets currently frozen around the world, with most of that held in Europe. We have some here in the United States. Well, like-minded countries agree that Russia should pay to build Ukraine. No country has yet been willing to take a first step to make that happen. As with all key decisions, points on assistance to Ukraine thus far, U.S. leadership is absolutely essential. We're here to provide that leadership. European countries have hidden behind traditional theoretical principles that protect sovereign state assets. However, Ukraine's situation is not a theoretical one. It's very real, and it has very real consequences. Sadly, the truth is that Russia will never agree to its obligations to compensate Ukraine, and Russia's veto powers have taken international compensation mechanisms off the table. Thus, the need for REPO. Given this reality, the international community is left with a choice. Will law-abiding nations stand by and allow Russia to skirt its international obligations? Or will we acknowledge that both domestic and international law must evolve in order to meet this relatively new problem and unique problem? Make no mistake, this situation presents the international legal system with one of the greatest tests since World War II. The entire international system is based on the premise of international peace and security through respect of territorial sovereignty. If international law cannot resolve this, cannot evolve and hold Russia accountable for violating not only a foundational principle of the UN, but also this most basic tenet of the international system in the modern age, we stand no chance of deterring China from invading Taiwan or other authoritarian countries from future aggression. The stakes are simply too high for us to let arcane legal theories keep us from doing what needs to be done. Over the course of this conflict, we have seen that U.S. leadership on key assistance to Ukraine, from critical munitions to tanks to fighter aircraft, fighter pilot training to long-range missiles, almost invariably led to other countries to follow suit. This multiplies the amount of assistance many times over. Now, I do not want to in any way denigrate or take away from what the Europeans have done. They have stepped up. We push and shove back and forth, arguing who's doing more. That's not particularly relevant. The fact is, both sides of the Atlantic are working on this issue and should. And it has really been the thing that has brought our partnerships on NATO together, our NATO countries together, and stronger, more so than it's been in many years. If Russia refuses to honor its moral and legal obligations to compensate Ukraine to help them rebuild, other countries can and should seize Russian sovereign assets and transfer them to Ukraine. Additionally, the United States can and should lead on this issue by passing legislation granting domestic legal authority to seize and transfer Russian sovereign assets to Ukraine and work with our allies to do the same. We are going through a legal process, a lawful process, and due process. This is why I introduced the Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunity for Ukraine Act. The REPO Act is actually a pretty simple piece of legislation. It does four things. First and foremost, The REPO Act grants the president authority to seize Russian sovereign assets frozen in the United States. It also gives the president the authority to transfer those assets to Ukraine for reconstruction. Under current U.S. law, there is no clear-cut way to seize sovereign assets of another country unless the United States is effectively at war with that country. The bill also makes clear that this would be a one-time authority and that applies only to Russia in this unique circumstance. Second, because the president may not transfer all of Russia's frozen assets, the bill creates a prohibition that the president cannot return any Russian frozen assets until Russia has withdrawn its troops from Ukraine and agreed to fully compensate the Ukrainians. The bill also provides congressional oversight over any proposal to return Russia's assets to ensure that conditions have, in fact, been met. Third, the bill ensures that these funds can get to Ukraine quickly by limiting Russia's ability to challenge seizure in U.S. courts. Ukraine needs this money now if it has a hope of beginning to rebuild before the damage to its economy becomes irreparable. Russia would like nothing more than to tie these funds up over a decades-long time period of complex litigation in order to keep from having to pay up. Interestingly, our court system is designed that this is possible if we don't have this legislation to make things happen otherwise. This provision would provide congressional intent to U.S. courts in this unique and extraordinary situation that Russia should not be able to use the U.S. legal system to skirt its obligations and delay justice for Ukraine. Finally, the bill directs the president to engage with other like-minded allies and partners to establish an international compensation mechanism. While I believe the United States should have the authority to unilaterally seize Russian assets and send them to Ukraine, I do not believe that we should act alone. Indeed, we should have our partners with us. According to public reports, most of Russia's frozen assets are located in Europe. For us to make a dent in what Russia owes Ukraine, Europe will need to participate in this effort. But because this is an extraordinary situation, collective action in concert with our allies and partners will send the strongest possible message to Putin and any other authoritarian state contemplating illegal military action. And importantly, U.S. leadership here will be critical to encouraging our European allies. While the REPO Act is focused on U.S. Domestic law, it sends a strong message to our European partners that seizing Russia sovereign assets would also be legal and appropriate under international law. Under the international law of countermeasures, third-party countries have the right to take proportionate, temporary action aimed at compelling another state to comply with its legal obligations. Therefore, it is legal and appropriate for nations to terminate Russia's sovereign immunity and transfer Russian assets to Ukraine for reconstruction. Some critics argue that this bill would limit the president's ability to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine. Those with this view argue that the president should have total flexibility to use Russia's frozen assets as a carrot to entice Russia to the negotiating table, and that placing preconditions on the return of these assets, as well as congressional oversight, hinders that ability. However, this legislation actually gives the president more tools to compel Russia to negotiate. By giving the president the discretion to use this authority, he will have added credibility in negotiations up to and until this authority is exercised. By making seizure a real possibility, Putin will be under greater pressure to make a deal and meet meaningful conditions of withdrawal and compensation. If Putin refuses, then this creates the pathway to make Ukraine whole. Additionally, if Russia were to attempt to challenge seizure in U.S. federal courts, the bill would give the Department of Justice lawyers the ammunition they need to rebuff these challenges. The argument I would probably hear most often is that seizing Russia's sovereign assets will set a new precedent and undermine sovereign immunity. The principle, by the way, all of which have grown up over a period of time and are there for a reason, and in general and normal circumstances, good propositions. The principle that states are immune from having their property expropriated by other states to settle debts is an incredibly important principle. And the fact that the law of countermeasures has never been used to suspend sovereign immunity with regard to seizure of state assets is important. However, like most legal precedents, there are rare and extreme cases where exceptions are necessary as long there are appropriate guardrails to keep the exceptions limited. Indeed, there is precedent for seizing sovereign assets of an aggressor state. In 1991, the international community collectively seized Iraqi sovereign assets following Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. I believe Russia's war in Ukraine is another unique but rare situation that warrants such similar actions and is both legal, appropriate, and very much in line with the single precedent that's out there, and that is the Iraq-Kuwait situation. Still, others argue that if countries take Russia's assets, Russia will retaliate by seizing those countries' assets located inside Russia. Putin is already seizing Western assets. In April, Russia announced a new presidential decree, which ironically cited the doctrine of countermeasures as justification to seize private companies if they are based in countries deemed unfriendly by the Kremlin. So the Russians themselves have provided a clear legal precedent to this action. So they've already done this, and it's appropriate that we follow suit. Unfriendly countries is an interesting proposition by the Kremlin. That's probably everybody, with the exception of all the badniks out there, like North Korea and China and Iran and Cuba and Venezuela, but only a handful amongst the 200 countries on the planet. Some critics have also expressed concern that if the United States were to take Russian assets, we might seize other countries' assets. They also fear that countries would move their sovereign investments outside the United States or finance their investments in other currencies. The fear is that confiscation would weaken the value of the dollar globally. This argument doesn't hold water. Some countries have already tried to shift transactions away from the dollar, like China demanding that Saudi Arabia pay them for their oil using the yuan. There is a reason these efforts have failed and been rebuffed. The dollar is the clear and safe global standard for international investment, period. It is highly unlikely, at least for the foreseeable future, that another currency could overtake the dollar. It is also clear this bill targets a very specific and unique case. The approach in the REPO Act does not just represent my view. In crafting this legislation, I have worked closely with constitutional law professors, international law experts, policy practitioners, European partners, Ukrainian legal advocates, and Ukrainian government officials. This effort to bring so many stakeholders to the table is why this bill is the bill on Russian sovereign assets that has bipartisan, bicameral, and enthusiastic support. It is also why the REPO Act is Ukraine's top legislative request of us on Capitol Hill. In the Senate, I've partnered with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a strong advocate for anti-money laundering and a key architect of legislation enabling the seizure of private Russian assets in the United States. Other Senate co-sponsors include Senator Wicker, ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and Senator Graham, ranking member of the Senate Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. In the House, the Foreign Affairs Committee just passed its version of the bill by an overwhelming bipartisan majority of 40-2. The REPO Act has also been endorsed by legal and policy scholars from all parts of the political spectrum outside of government. We are entering a new phase of strategic competition that is growing more fierce with each passing day. We need to develop and use new and more creative tools to not only seek justice for those who are wronged, but to deter bad actors from doing things like Russia has done clearly in Ukraine. The countries that want to undermine and change the international system, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, don't care about the rule of law and never have, and they don't care about precedents. We must be willing to put them on notice that we will not act with impunity, that they will not be allowed to act with impunity. They will be made to pay. The REPO Act will show them that that is true. And I thank all of you who share this enthusiasm and support this effort. And I commit to you that we'll move as diligently as we can to get this legislation across the finish line. So with that, I'll take a question or two or whatever you like. Yeah, I'll take a couple questions.
Does anyone have any questions for the Senator? Your hand was up first.
Yes. Thank you. It's an issue I've thought about for a long time.
I guess my simple question is, where is the State Department on this issue?
Well, we have worked with across the board, okay? And State Department is important. But just as importantly is the National Security Council. And we have worked with both of them to hone this legislation to the point where everybody can embrace it. As always, there's different views and there's some pushing and shoving on the details, as always. That's the way the democratic system works. But I can tell you that as far as this legislation is concerned, we don't have stumbling blocks. We don't have blockage. We have a bipartisan, good faith effort to bring all those things together. It includes the State Department and includes the National Security Council, and those are important. Thank you. Good question.
Senator Dan Flatley with Bloomberg News. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Dan.
I wanted to ask about prospects for getting this through Congress this year. The new House Speaker, Mike Johnson, has voiced support for this idea. Can you give us an update on whether this will make it into the defense bill, or is there some other way of moving it soon? Thanks.
Yeah, Dan, as you know, the system is complex up on the Hill as to how we move stuff forward. I met with Mike McCall, my counterpart from the other side last night, and we had this exact discussion. I would say to you, and I really don't want to focus on one because otherwise that's what people do and other doors may close. But there are a number of ways that this could go. I can, as a bottom line, I will tell you, I am cautiously optimistic that we will push this through one of those doors. And there are multiple doors to push it through. And I wouldn't feel that way if there wasn't the broad support that there is for this. So thanks for the question. I know you like to get into the weeds like I do. Most people don't care that much about it, but you have to do that if you're going to get the legislation passed. We'll get this done. The exact train it rides on, let's see what trains arrive at the station. Thank you.
Hi, Lauren Guillaume with Rosin for Ukraine. You mentioned how the House is putting effort behind moving this bill. We have your tremendous leadership in the Senate side. What would you say to the general public to move the political will? Because we need this bill to happen urgently, especially given the political landscape. So what remarks would you give?
Well, I think to the general public, I would say that if you want this in the rearview mirror, and everybody does, however strongly you feel about what support we should give to Ukraine, and we all know the reasons for our national security, why we have to be there. In fact, in April when I was here, we spent the entire time talking about the reasons we need to do this. But if you want it in the rearview mirror, this is really one of the best ways to do it. The world works on money. And when you're talking about this kind of money, and it is a very significant amount of money, if we can get our hands on that money and transfer it over to Ukraine, that will go a long ways to debilitating the Russian ability to move forward with the war. And look, and the bottom line is, this is just flat the right thing to do. I mean, almost any human being of goodwill could stand back and look at this if you knew nothing about it, if you had no politics involved, you had no knowledge of the parties, and you said, this is what one party did, and this is what happened to the other party, on a kindergarten school ground, they would say, well, these guys should pay. I mean, it's that simple. So that's what I would say. I'll take one more. That's good. I'm glad. I'd love to answer all the questions. That's wonderful. Thanks so much. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you so much, Senator. The fact that we ran out of questions was pretty telling, I think, about how comprehensive a speech that was and how compelling the case is for the measures contained in the Act. So thank you very much for your continued leadership. We're now going to move to the sort of expert panel discussion section. So I could ask our esteemed panelists to come and take their place on the stage. And we'll also have time probably for a Q&A as well.
Scoot down, I'll take you.
Take this one.
Okay, well, that was I had a whole bunch of questions to put to you all, but that was such a great speech by the senator. I was rapidly crossing them off as it went down. But Elena, I wondered if I could start with you and just get your thoughts as a Ukrainian. To put it bluntly, a lot of the debate at the moment in DC is between people who see the value and the American interest in supporting Ukraine, and I think the American people, polling shows time and again, they're happy to do that. But as you know, there are voices growing louder and louder about the cost to US taxpayers of doing this. I don't think they fully grasp the math of how all this works and how this is building up our security capabilities at the same time. But as a Ukrainian, do you enjoy seeing US taxpayers pay for your defense? Is this something that you would presumably support? You'd rather Russia paid for the damage that Russia is doing to your country, right?
So first of all, we as Ukrainians are extremely grateful for all of the assistance that we are receiving from the US, from the European Union, from other partners, because we are very often hearing that, we are not showing kind of enough gratitude. That is not true. I mean, that is not our intention. We are extremely grateful, but we have to ask for more simply because Russia's aggression is continuing. And Russia is definitely planning for the long war. Their eventual goal hasn't changed. It is to subjugate Ukraine. And if their blitzkrieg failed, then they understand that in the protracted war, it would be much more complicated for Ukraine to win because we are smaller, because this is our economy, which is being destroyed. Just over the last year, we lost almost 30% of our GDP. It is our energy, critical infrastructure is being destroyed, and we have another winter ahead of us, which will be much harder than the previous one. And Russian missiles and Russian drones are raining on the heads of Ukrainian civilians, Ukrainian kids, women. And I mean, what Russia is doing, that's clearly the goal to depopulate Ukraine, to scare investors away, to cut our transport and export routes to be able to revive our economy and make money ourselves. And that is why, from that perspective, we think that Russian aggression is an incredibly dangerous precedent per se, because we are very often hearing when we are advocating for the confiscation of assets that that would create a dangerous precedent. But one dictatorship, large dictatorship, trying to take over the sovereign country by force, it's much more dangerous precedent. So while we are extremely grateful for the Western taxpayers' assistance, we do consider this as an investment in the global transatlantic security. And I think that Hudson expert Luke Coffey is doing a great job explaining why the return on this investment is comparatively, very high in itself. But we definitely have to think beyond the short-term planning horizon. We have to think what could be the sustainable source of supporting Ukraine in the mid and long-term perspective. Because definitely the confiscation of Russian assets cannot substitute the assistance which is right now being debated in the Congress, and we hope that it will have the bipartisan support because that's very important for us. But we have to think in the longer perspective. And with regards to that, I mean, I can absolutely subscribe by everything which the senator said. That was an amazing and, to be honest, very inspiring speech, because when we are meeting, and we are meeting a lot with European partners, we are doing a lot of advocacy in the US, in other countries. Very often we miss this feeling of the sense of urgency, that something which is happening right now, which Russia is doing, may change entire world order. And other dictators are taking notes, and other dictators are taking notes of the Western response. So that is why, long story short, making Russia pay is not only about providing Ukraine with the more secured source of sustainable support and assistance in the mid-term, in the long term, to make sure that we jointly have sufficient resources for Ukrainian victory. But this is also about holding an aggressor accountable. it is also about adding safeguards against other acts of aggression, because that's, you know, the dictators are calculating benefits and disadvantages of their acts of aggression, and this could be a very powerful, you know, addition against acts of aggression if they know that the West is ready to move forward as strongly and firmly as confiscating the assets in order to keep the world order free and rules-based. That is why we definitely have to make Russia pay, and yeah, that's the right way to go.
Thank you. I also realized I didn't introduce our panel at the start. I obviously didn't have enough coffee this morning. Elena Halushka from the International Center for Ukrainian Victory. And to my left is Rebecca Heinrichs, the director of our senior fellow here at Hudson, the director of our Keystone Defense Initiative, who testified or spoke on Congress recently about the REPO bill. Actually, Rebecca, can I just come straight to you and just pick up on that idea that Elena left on, which is this idea of deterrence and the broader context in which this bill is being brought forward. You know, you've written a lot about you know, how support for Ukraine is building up our sort of military security capabilities in a way that wouldn't have been possible perhaps in peacetime. The work we do at the Kleptocracy Initiative is about not the military preparedness that you write about, but economic and financial preparedness. Do you see this as, you know, as an important part of that? You know, you spend your day talking about the military situation, which is obviously first and foremost in everyone's mind. But do you see this as important as well?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me and for the opportunity to be able to speak on this. Yeah, I'm going to answer that from a sort of a policy perspective and why I became very interested in this from a deterrence perspective, and then also from a political sort of small p perspective, not in a partisan way, but why I think it's so incredibly important for what's happening globally right now. Essentially, there are two elements of the REPO bill that I note are very promising for affecting Putin's calculations. So this is where, whenever you think about deterrence, people kind of throw that word around a lot right now, and I think it's important to kind of flesh out what we mean by that. And that's that, you know, we're trying to get into the mind of Putin so that he concludes that it's time to end the conflict, that it is no longer going to be worth it economically to him from his own personal power perspective inside of Russia, and that it's now time to come up with an off-ramp for himself. We do not have to provide Vladimir Putin an off-ramp. He can make one up and sell one to the Russian people, but he needs to decide that now is the time to get out of Ukrainian territory and end this war. And so there's two components of the REPO bill that get at that. And one is this idea that Putin is going to outlast us, that we don't have the will, and that he does have a will that outlasts the United States and our allies. And so what this does is we're saying, actually, no, that we're going to confiscate the $300 billion around there in frozen Russian assets, and this would require a significant ally collaboration of about $200 billion in Europe. And then the second piece of that, which the senator spoke about, is really important, is the prohibition on the release of blocked Russian sovereign assets until Russia agrees to pay for it. And the reason this is so important is, in that Russia cannot be off the hook, is because somebody will pay to rebuild Ukrainian society when this war is over. That will happen. So that's an immovable fact of reality. It should not be primarily the American people. And it should not be primarily other European people, citizens, that it should primarily be the people who are responsible for this unprovoked war, and that's Russia. And we have those funds available to us. And so not to avail ourselves of those funds and put it back into the Ukrainian society, I think conveys something wrong and weak about the resolve of the United States and our allies. And so I think it's important that we pass this bill, even if the United States does that, obviously it's not going to get to all of the Russian frozen assets, but it would really demonstrate strong American leadership and then would push the Europeans to do the same thing. The Canadians have already done it. And the Canadians take international law very seriously. They've examined it, and they have determined that it does not make any sense for there to be harbor of Russian assets in our countries exploiting this concept of international law. And so really the international law is there for the thing that we're trying to get at, which is respect for national sovereignty and the rule of law, and that you cannot just go break into somebody's country and steal their people and their territory. And so really by not passing REPO, you're undermining the very principles on which international law are meant for. And then the other piece of this too that I think is really important is, once again, this demonstrates that there is strong bipartisan congressional support for Ukraine, and really has been leading in pushing the administration. And so that you've seen this on particular weapon systems, ATACMS, DPICMS, the harpoons. I will save you from going down the list, but this is something that Congress has been continually pushing the administration to do more. And once again, they're doing this on this particular piece, and I think that that's a pretty just a compelling part of the story in terms of the American support for Ukraine. So, and then the last piece to turn. So it really does, I think, would affect Putin's calculations about his ability to outlast and how much he's willing to spend on this particular war effort. But then also it also conveys to China. There's this idea that when it comes to finances in our economies, that the United States is not willing to pull that lever. And I think that this would, again, it's not, China's a whole different, very, very difficult problem when it comes to how integrated our economies are. But I think it does send the right signal that the United States is willing to use these particular tools to penalize authoritarian aggression and imperialism. And so it sends the right kind of message at the right time for Xi Jinping if he's considering a move on, for instance, Taiwan. And with that, turn it over to my
Thank you, well said. Yeah, Chris Socha, last but not least, I should say, Staff Director, the US Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, been working with the Senator on this legislation. Any thoughts you may want to add in addition to something that the Senator may not have had the time to mention? But also, just picking up on what Rebecca ended on, do you see this legislation as discrete and standalone for Russia? Or is this something you could kind of copy and paste this text if, for example, Iran decided to start causing more conflict in the Middle East? Or if China's decided to invade Taiwan, is this going to become a universal principle of our sort of economic and financial readiness to deal with conflicts like that? And is this kind of legislation the way to do that?
Well, as both the senator said and as my colleagues have said, I think this is first and foremost, yes, a point specific to Ukraine and Russia invading. You look at, we have to first step back and look at the legal foundation of, or lack thereof, in terms of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The ICJ had ruled that it was in violation of international law. Others have said similar. Whereas other international conflicts that you've seen, whether that was the U.S. Invasion of Afghanistan, was done so under the imprimatur of international law to do that. That is the important distinction here, and must be very, very clearly understood. And that is the premise behind then seizing sovereign assets in terms of the repayment for Ukraine in this regard. Russia did this without any imprimatur of international legitimacy, and therefore its action is a pariah in the international system. If you find a similar case like that going forward, then yes, this should be used as an example for a future case. But that is the important distinction that I think needs to be clearly drawn here in that regard. If you had a Chinese PRC invasion of Taiwan, I'd be very curious to see what legal basis they would use to say that they are entitled to do that. And I think that is part of the deterrent message that Rebecca refers to, that I think the United States being willing to take this step in coordination with our allies should send a very, very powerful signal to the international community that you can't do this without expecting some sort of consequence in terms of financial assets, sovereign assets, to this. So I think it's an incredibly important deterrent signal. To the senator's note, if we do this for Ukraine, it will have been done twice in 40 years. And I think that's something important as well to consider in this. But this is the greater piece. This is a new era of global competition. And you have to think about new tools or tools that have existed in the past being used in different ways if you want to maintain deterrence, if you want to discourage certain actions that we find to be particularly egregious. And a hesitancy to use this as a tool sends a mixed message in the global competition that we have to be very, very careful that we don't send. We are, I know the one reporter, Dan Flatley, asked about like different mechanisms to get this across the finish line. There are legislative mechanisms that the senator referenced, but there are things that the international community can do. We will have a G7 meeting in December where this has been discussed previously. I would love them to come up with a more robust announcement in December that they are moving in this direction. Reinforced by the legislation as well, but there are things that our G7 allies can do to continue to move this in the proper direction. That would be again another powerful signal in terms of that deterrent message. So I think there's a lot of different things that we can do going forward in the next couple months to continue to push this issue.
Great, Rebecca?
Yeah, I wanted to put a finer point too on the point that I started to make about how it's really smart politics too. And this kind of gets at the question somebody asked about Speaker Johnson and mentioning REPO and why I think that this is really important. The American support for Ukraine and against Russia is still high, but I think we would not be honest if we didn't mention the fact that it seems to be flagging a little bit. And I think part of that is, though, is because the American people do want to understand when we can see this in the rearview mirror, as the senator alluded to. And I think that this particular legislative initiative and the bipartisan support behind it, part of the reason why it is so attractive is because it's good stewardship of the American taxpayer dollars when we have the Russian frozen assets available to us. And so to be able to communicate to the American people that yes, the United States can do what we can do best, providing weapons for the war effort, and I left that part out of my remarks today, but I can go on about how well the Ukrainians have been able to succeed, how well they've been able to fight back on the Russians and push them back out of their territory using American ISR and our weapons, and then the United States has been able to use this opportunity to replenish our own stocks. The American people understand that piece. And then when it comes to rebuilding Ukrainian society, you start to wonder, then who's going to do this? And we have an answer to that. A big chunk of it is going to come from the Russians. And we have a practical, no kidding, realistic way to do that. And so I think in terms of the political moment, it's right for that. It's very smart, and I think it's going to be what helps maintain that support from the American people to help end this war on terms that are favorable to Ukraine.
Absolutely. Those who complain the loudest about U.S. taxpayer dollars going to fund the reconstruction of a Ukrainian welfare state, blather on about that stuff if you want, but you should be the foremost supporters of seizing Russia's assets to pay for that, right? You wanted to add something?
Yeah, I would actually, I was listening, Chris' interaction, and I want to add that why Ukrainian case is very unique in itself, because this is not an ordinary war, as I've said already. That's an imperialistic conquest when one country tries to take over another one. But there are also a lot of other things that make this Russian aggression very unique, starting from the fact that Russia violated Budapest Memorandum, upon which we gave up third largest nuclear arsenal upon Russian guarantees and promises not to attack us and provide us with the security. Then they occupied Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. And since the full-scale war started, just take a look what they have done, apart from major, huge war crimes, very unique crimes, which are kind of, somehow already legitimized because there was no proper international response for that. So Russians occupied and continue doing nuclear terrorism at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest one in Europe, and not a single sanction against Rosatom was imposed for that. Russians are doing major deportations of kids. So what we have, our government has documented are more than 20,000 cases, but Russians themselves report, and they are proud of deporting around 750,000 kids. That's almost 1 million. Those kids who stay in the occupied territories are very largely brainwashed, denazified, even their names and surnames under the pressure, are being changed on this Russian manner. I mean, they are getting forceful passportization Russian. We are seeing a very deliberate, targeted attacks, not only on the energy system, but nuclear power plants, those that are not occupied. And we've seen a month ago an attack on the Khmelnytsky a nuclear power plant, not even speaking about the Pivdano-Ukrainska nuclear power plant, where Russian missiles, are flying over it, almost every second month. Attackings on the export infrastructure, stealing our food and grain. Just a few days ago, there was an investigation that Russians were buying a lot of new trucks, in order to deliberately steal our grain and sell it on the international market. So all those things, and that was just something, I was throwing while listening to other panelists. So I'm sure that this list can be done much longer, which makes this Russian aggression already very unique, and which would give enough justification to make sure that this instrument, which we are pushing for, would be, a kind of a stand-alone case, which will create positive precedent and not a negative precedent opening Pandora's box.
Sorry, go ahead.
If I can add to this, I think there's also, again, speaking in this greater power competition piece to this, you do have a coalition of countries that are working against democracy, that are working against the Western values that Europe, the United States, some of our Pacific allies represent. And one of the concerns that exists here is that in the absence of Russia paying for the reconstruction of Ukraine, that several of those others aligned with Russia will try to come in with their own financial resources to rebuild Ukraine. I specifically referenced China in this regard. And whether it's seizing very good Ukrainian defense technology, whether it's trying to set standards in Ukraine away from Western standards that the United States and Europe have set, allowing that foothold for China to come in with its own resources to rebuild Ukraine is something we need to be very, very careful with. Seizing Russian assets in order to pay for the reconstruction, having Western partners, Western contractors helping participate in that is incredibly important as part of this broader great power competition. And we need to be very, very careful about how we move forward in that regard. Seizing Russian assets helps us avoid some of those tougher choices.
I remember before the invasion, China's economic footprint in Ukraine was already growing quite substantially. They were really interested in poking around there. We have just a few minutes, just a couple of minutes. If anyone has any sort of questions, I think you were first, sir.
Fred Bonin from the Daily REPO. I'm also a Gold Star dad, and I wanted to thank our Ukrainian friend there for all their country's sacrifice. It seems disingenuous for Americans to, since 1947, have spent trillions of dollars defending against the Russians, and for a mere $100 billion, they've destroyed over half the Russian army, and we've gone 812 days without a combat casualty. So thank you. Thank you for keeping our kids safe.
I usually discourage comments in favor of questions, but that was an absolutely lovely and appropriate comment, so thank you very much. I think there was someone else back there. There we go, sir.
Hi, Michael DeChana, former State Department analyst on Ukraine issues. Do you think that Western leaders are too afraid of bankrupting Russia? There's like a constant discussion that the war will end when Putin's mafia friends decide it's not worth it anymore. But there's also the second part of that is Putin's regime ends when Putin's mafia friends think it's not worth it anymore. How much is the concern of a Russian economic collapse hindering economic sanctions and other economic punishment against Russia for this aggression?
I don't know if anyone has it, but I thought you've been doing the rounds in Europe, Elena. And I think that question probably is far more on their mind than it is
Well,
here,
it
here in
is
Washington.
absolutely the question because, from the very beginning, I mean, my organization is called International Center for Ukrainian Victory. It was established in the first days after the full-scale war started, when the world was still, watching paralyzed, whether Ukraine will fall in 3 days, maybe in 1 week, then okay, you've gone through this first weeks, but will you survive first months? And, there was no belief that Ukraine is actually absolutely capable of winning this war and should be given all of the sufficient resources to do this fast, because every day of fighting costs us the most precious asset which we have, our people, the lives of our people. And I think that the issue is, that the goal defines the means. And if the goal is to help Ukraine win, that would mean that Russia should be defeated, because you cannot have Ukrainian victory and something in between, in Russia. Despite the fact that I fully agree with Rebecca that even, Russian defeat, Putin will come up with the idea how to sell it to his internal audience to make sure that this is not hurting him that much. But this is not okay that you have to campaign to get modern battle tanks for 9 months and fighter jets for more than a year and, long-range missiles for 1.5 years. And why there is this, self-restraining kind of, approach of the Western leaders? One of the reasons which we were hearing that, there is no understanding what will be in Russia after their defeat, whether, that there will be collapse of the regime or whatever. And that is why, we are having fragmented sanctions, which unfortunately are not effective because Western technologies continue ending up in Russian missiles and in Russian drones all the time. We are seeing, that Russians are increasingly trading oil above the price cap, while, itself the price cap is not that effective. It has to be lowered, minimum twice, but even this price cap is not implemented. And, only a handful of Russian banks are under the sanctions. Why not all of the 330? So this, self-limitation, unfortunately, it is hurting Ukraine very much. Because if the goal is to support Ukrainian victory, whatever it takes, and as fast as it is needed, then, it would significantly change the dynamics of the assistance.
So if I can just add to that. So one thing and this goes on the military side too, the one thing that I've been really focusing on is, and I agree that if you have to, one of the things that we have not done well, we as a country, and pointing of course to the White House on this, is you have to decide what you want the outcome to be, and then you develop a strategy, and then you resource the strategy. And we have not done that. And so I've been very uncomfortable with the "as long as it takes" slogan. Absolutely. Because it is, you have to define what it is, and then you should resource it and use the tools at your disposal to do that. There is a fear, as mentioned, it was a sort of a self-restraint. I would say that we are out of practice as a country on thinking through, which we understood during the Cold War, this idea of escalation. We keep hearing about escalation, now I call it the E word. That everyone's afraid of that. But actually, the only way Ukraine wins is if they escalate to the point where the Russians make the decision to stop. Because the alternative is they are in a long war of attrition that is extremely expensive in blood and treasure. It's strategic incoherence on the part of the United States and our alliances, and it's deeply immoral. And so, I agree with kind of the assumptions that are in that question, that we should be using the tools at our disposal smartly smartly. But in order for Ukraine to be able to seize the momentum and actually force a conclusion to this conflict, that is something that we still have not seen. And so all of these categories of weapons do eventually seem to be released, but it takes enormous amount of pressure on the part of Ukraine and Congress. Congress has been leading from the beginning. Yes. It's not often how the media portrays it. It seems like, sort of it's just one particular party that's a drag. But across the board, in terms of leadership on both parties and pushing and collaborating, and really on the Republican side, pushing hard too, on things like DPICMs when it was not popular, and ATACMs, and long-range ATACMs, not just short-range ATACMs, and real-time intelligence provision on the part of the United States. I mean, these are all things that have been, really pushed, and it shouldn't have to be. It shouldn't have to be, especially since we seem to always end up getting there, but only after we sort of calibrate and see, make sure it didn't make the Russians too mad, the last thing we did. So I do think we have to have a strategic mindset sort of shift to help Ukraine gain the momentum and take the initiative to drive the Russians finally out of their sovereign territory.
The only thing I'd add to that, echoing what my colleagues have said, is early on in the days of this conflict, there are a number of people who believed that you could use frozen sovereign assets as a way to buy a ceasefire. Yeah. And so there was a hesitancy to move down the path, and this is part of why Congress has pushed so hard. And that's also why there are limitations on what you can use the assets for in the language, that Russia must fully withdraw before you could ever return an asset to them. This money was dangled in front of the Russians as an effort to get them to, well, just stop shooting for a while. Clearly they didn't take that offer, but this is why we have come in and said you can't even do that. They have to fully withdraw. And so that, I think, is one of the challenges in terms of taking these assets, is that there's this idea that somehow we can get back to the way things were. I think this legislation is the definitive answer that you have to have a different strategy toward Russia. We have to admit the reality in the world as it is and move on and recalibrate our policy toward Russia.
That's fantastic. Thank you all so much. We've come right up to time now. So, we can't endorse legislation from Hudson, but I'm hearing that the measures in the REPO Act and the principle generally that Russia should pay by us confiscating frozen assets is a really good one. Give the president more leverage in any future, time that he may need it. It's a cost-effective way for Americans to show their support for Ukraine, which they still overwhelmingly want to do, despite all the sort of noises you hear here in Washington. And I wish you, Chris, and your office all the best of it. And I thank you, Elena and Rebecca, for joining us today. And thank you all for coming out to hear more about this fascinating and exciting idea for moving us a step closer to Ukrainian victory and accountability for Russia.